Yisrael, Yehudim. I have a message that Yahowah, God's one and only name, in case you were unfamiliar with it, wants me to share with you at this very moment. I became aware of a series of prophecies that heretofore had gone unresolved for 2,700 years. These prophecies are found in the Great Isaiah Scroll and were written 2,700 years ago by a prophet whose name means Yahweh delivers. And in the 11th chapter of his book, he tells you who I am and why I'm here, even how I'm delivering this message to you, why I would understand what follows. In the 14th chapter of Yeshaya, he introduces you to my adversary, your adversary, the adversary, Hasatan, and explains who he is and what he wants. Then in the 17th and 18th chapters, he reveals something that is exceptionally poignant and pertinent to where we are today. And it is what I'm going to speak to you about, along with some Muslims that I've come to know along the way. This is not great news, Israel, but I want you to listen. Forearmed, you are at least going to be prepared for what is coming your way. The prophet revealed, using some 20 attributes that can only now be attributed to the United States of America, told us that Israel would be abandoned by America and that the nation would be thinned at the waist and become indefensible. That is to say that what is touted as the two-state solution, which isn't something anybody should advocate because it is the very thing, according to the prophets and common sense, will make Israel indefensible and therefore subject to attack. And in this case, it's a attack that is going to be 1,000 times worse than 10/7 of 23. 1,000 times the aerial bombardments, 1,000 times the Islamic jihadists. And that this attack will lead the world to global war. Having written the various volumes of Yada Yahowah, this is presented in observations and it's presented throughout the various books that comprise the 33 some odd that are currently on the bookshelf, not only behind me here, but at yadayah.com. I was able to detail precisely when this is going to occur, how it is going to occur. I predicted the events of 10/7/23 a year before they occurred, and I am predicting now because I have read future history. I know what Yahweh said is going to happen to his people and when it's going to occur. Now, in your immediate future. Now, knowing that the war here coincides with the Shabuah harvest, according to the prophet Yeshaya in the 17th chapter again, and that Shabuah means 7, and that Yahweh is returning with the Messiah in year 6,000 Yah, which is 40 Yobel, from the time that Yahweh and Dod fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Bakodim in 33 CE, making it Yom Kippurim in 2033. It's not very difficult to step back 7 years and realize that the fulfillment of Towrah is going to occur on the 22nd of May in 2026. And that is when we are told that the dissolution of Israel will take place, where Israel is thinned at the waist, where the two-state solution would render Israel, about this wide, where 70% of the population resides. Recognizing this timing and who is president of the United States and deciphering his rhetoric before and now after taking office, there's only one reasonable conclusion. Donald Trump is the next Neville Chamberlain. He is the one who is going to trade Israel's heart for promises of peace, for a Nobel Peace Prize, and for large financial bribes from the Saudi Arabians. I wish I didn't have to bring you that news, but it is conclusive and it is inevitable. I want you to brace for it. And in this last 2 weeks, something rather extraordinary has happened. Well, actually, if you go back now a matter of weeks and begin at the beginning of this, remember when Donald Trump was screaming that all hell would break loose if the hostages were not released before he took office? And then he dispatched his golfing buddy, Whitcliffe, who was the subject of a $623 million bribe by the Qataris to represent the Qatari influence in Islam and their influence over Hamas to force Israel to deal with the devil and to trade up to 60 convicted Islamic terrorists with blood on their hands who have raped and murdered Jews for innocent hostages. Well, I explained how that was a horrible outcome and that trading with the devil in this regard would guarantee a far worse outcome, that the few lives saved in this process would be lost hundreds, if not 1,000 times over in the consequence of releasing those who would go back to their previous occupation, which was to kill Jews. Moving on, we realized that the hostage release did not go as Donald Trump had promised. Some were released, many not. And the conditions upon which they were released were demonic. And during the release, there was something that should have been visible to all the world and certainly to the IDF and to Israelis. Those who have listened to me over a prolonged period of time know that on 10/7/23, I told you that if you invaded Gaza to hunt down and kill the Hamas terrorists that you blame for 10/7, you will manufacture more of them than you kill, because Hamas isn't the enemy. Islam is. And you cannot fight a religious foe with bullets and bombs. You always manufacture more of them than you kill. And my goal from the beginning has been to encourage Israel to fight by deploying your brains instead of your bombs. And during those video casts of the demonic performances around the hostage release in Gaza, there was absolute proof of what the IDF has already announced, which is that Hamas has not just reconstituted itself. There's more Islamic jihadists now in Gaza than there were before Israel invaded. So the strategy that you're deploying, Israel, has not only turned the world against you, but more importantly, it has been— so now with the most recent pronouncements. I want to walk you through, Israel, what your choices are, because I want you to make better choices. Since I know your future, I want you to get there as unscathed as possible. And you might say, well, who are you to speak to Israel? Well, I represent Yahowah, your God. He spoke of me often. I am the man from Edom. That ought to be credential enough. But if it's not enough for you, I'm the man who wrote the most comprehensive and irrefutable book explaining the true nature of Islam. I'm the one who was the first to put the Quran in chronological order and set it into the context of Muhammad's life through the oldest and most credible hadith sources, so that you would know exactly who Muhammad and Allah are and why they have declared genocide on Jews. The book is irrefutable and it is free. goddamnreligion.org. I would encourage you to go there now. And for having done so, I have received many thousands of death threats. So, Israel, I have some skin in the game. I've given a lot to stand up for you. All I ask now is you listen to what I have to say. When Donald Trump, and I want you to understand that when I speak of a political person, I'm not speaking with a political bias. I have none. I am apolitical. I am like Yahowah in this regard. I disregard both political parties in America and left and right political debates worldwide. I am anti-religious, as is God, and apolitical, as is Yahowah. When Donald Trump announced that his intent was, and he assured that he was going to accomplish it, that he was going to move the Gazans out of Gaza into Egypt and into Jordan, about 1 million to each place or so. And while that sounds wonderful if you are an Israeli on the surface, and I spend a lot of time on X, so I know how Israelis respond to this sort of thing, it's a horrible idea. There are currently about 2.1 million people in Jordan who wrongly ascribe themselves as Palestinians. There is no such thing as a Palestinian. They're just malcontent Muslims. But that's the identity that they have falsely ascribed to themselves, and it is a religious and political identity that you're never going to convince them otherwise. They view themselves as refugees. They're not. The land has never been theirs. It will never be theirs. But that's how they view themselves. And in a religious or overtly political community, evidence and reason mean nothing in terms of dispelling lies. So that 2.1 million people, if you add another million people to them, will become more malcontent, more bloodthirsty in their desire to eliminate the state of Israel and to exterminate Jewish lives. And they will have unfettered access to weapons. While the Jordanian government has tried to keep the Fakistinians there unarmed, because the last time they were armed, they tried to overthrow the monarchy. They are not welcome anywhere, including there. They're going to lose that battle. If they're moved, and you have 3 million of them in Jordan, then Muslims from around the world will find a way, particularly now with Syria under the control of an Islamic terrorist organization that once called itself the Islamic State, that they will find ways to arm them. And 3 million jihadists, of which half will be young men armed to the teeth, is a very frightening thing, because the IDF can easily defeat a military that attacks with airplanes and tanks, but has already shown that it is completely inept when dealing with a flood of jihadists. Going the other way, if the Gazans, these malcontent Muslims, who are now quarantined in Gaza because Israel finally did as I asked on 10/7 and occupied the south and therefore precluded weapons from entering Gaza through Egypt. The Gazans and these Muslims in Gaza have essentially no way to arm themselves. All they could bring into Israel at this point is sticks and stones. But you move them out of Gaza and into the Sinai, into Egypt. They will not only metastasize and grow through to become not only a million, but millions of enraged jihadists, because, as I will share, Islam breeds a hatred of Jews. That is not a function of radicalization. That is not a function of a corruption of the religion. That is the essence of the Quran and the Hadith, Muhammad's life, Allah's orders. And so you move a million Muslims who are committed to the destruction of Israel out of the quarantine in Gaza into the Sinai, and they will be armed to the teeth. You'll have no way to preclude them being armed. And the Egyptian government would love to see Israel destroyed. They'll help them. They might even join them. That's a really bad idea. And I've tried to warn everyone against it. The safest bet is for Israel to correctly diagnose what Islam represents by reading the 5 volumes of goddamn religion, which are irrefutable, and then quarantine this deadly plague, which can be done in Gaza. Allow them to live in the hell they created for themselves. Now, Trump then doubled down and said he was going to turn Gaza into a resort, that it would be somehow deeded from Israel to the United States. And he later said he was going to purchase it, I don't know from whom, and that he was going to build a world-class resort there. And he then announced that it would not be for the Gazans. How are you going to move them out? What are you going to get? A line a mile long of bulldozers, 3 or 4 bulldozers deep, and push them out? Are you going to run over them? What are you going to do? Hamas is not going to allow anyone to leave without doing what the Russians did in the Second World War. You either charge with your unloaded rifle against the Germans, or we'll shoot you in the back. There's no way to move them out. They've been indoctrinated to believe, as Erdogan said yesterday, that Gaza is their eternal homeland. I responded, no. Hell is their eternal homeland. But you aren't going to get them to move out. Not even to the lure of emerald cities filled with gold. No. Not going to happen. So today, after witnessing the fact that Hamas did not behave well during these hostage releases, now called them off, Trump has tripled down and said, well, if they're not all released, every hostage, everybody, by noon on Saturday, that Israel is free to do whatever they want to do with Gaza. Turn it into hell. That's not a particularly good idea either. Israel's bombardment of Gaza has not turned out well for anyone. It's not been productive. It will never be productive. You cannot kill your way to victory when fighting a religious foe. Somewhere along the way, you got to engage your brains, Israel, and recognize that what you've been doing is foolish, and listen to what I have to say. You're manufacturing more terrorists than you're killing. You're turning the world against you. Sacrificing your sons and daughters in Gaza again is a very bad idea. And the promise that you have of eliminating Hamas's influence in Gaza is not possible, because Hamas is Islam. And you are not going to root out the Islam from a Muslim, ever. So there you are. What are you going to do? You're at a crossroads now. You have the President of the United States telling you that you can go back in and destroy the rest of Gaza. Prepare it for his resort, I guess. All you're going to do is make a bad situation worse. You have the President of the United States saying you're going to move the Gazans into Jordan, into Egypt. Bad idea. It's going to make a bad situation much worse. It's going to lead to exactly what Yahowah, Isaiah said in the 17th chapter, where right after the heart of Israel is carved out and Israel is narrowed at the waist, creating this state of terror that Muslims are going to flood into Israel in such numbers that they cannot be stopped. So, what now, Israel? What I recommended on 10/7 was for Israel to immediately do a number of things. The first was to release the raw footage of everything that had happened on 10/7. There are some now. I have posted them on X, on Facebook. We even tried on YouTube, which didn't work. YouTube's not quite moral enough to allow that sort of thing. But the new Mark Zuckerberg Facebook did. And so has X, thanks to the courage and character of Elon Musk. But it should have been done over a year ago. And more should have been done. That as the Muslims screaming Allahu Akbar that are taking hoes and chopping off the heads of wounded men and blowing away children, incinerating women, raping them, even shooting dogs. The lives of those who were lost, were kidnapped, needed to be shown for what the Muslims robbed from them. The beauty of these individuals and their lives and their families and everything that was taken from them. And that presentation should have been put together by the Israeli government, even if they spent $1 billion on the production of it, to preclude anyone from marching in the streets thereafter, calling death to Israel and blaming the victims for what was perpetrated against them. And someone, I said this on X, and some idiot wrote back, the people that believe Israel are going to believe Israel, and the people that are going to be against Israel are going to be against Israel. Doesn't matter what you say then. Why be so defeatist? Why don't you slit your own throat then? Now, here's the reality. What you need to do, Israel, to survive is to make it difficult to be your enemy. What you need to do is to show progressives that have turned against you that they are allied with rapists, misogynists, pedophiles, mass murderers, tyrants, those who advance the slave trade, who give women no rights, who abuse their own children, mass murderers, that they're in league with these people, and prove it so that it makes it exceedingly uncomfortable for them to be out there in the streets. They do that. You show the truth. You make it impossible for them to do so and have even one fiber of morality. some will still do it, but most won't. Not against that. And then you do as I have done. You expose the truth about Muhammad, Allah, the Quran, and Islam, so that the world can't galvanize with this religion, can't align with this religion. No one can support it. Everyone is forewarned about it. And it takes all of the bad Muslims, those who haven't fully embraced the annihilation of Jews, and it puts them on notice that their religion is savage and demonic and has no legitimate basis. I'm a reasonably rational person. When I figured that about my religion when I was growing up, I left it. And so will many of them. This is what I mean by fighting this battle with your brains and not with bombs. I also told you that if you look at the last hostage release, the 3 men who, if you look at before and after pictures of these men, it is symbolic of the before and after pictures of Gaza. They're so emaciated. That the symbols behind them were Alaska Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. They have to be removed. 10/7 was flood of Alaska, just as Yahowah said it would be. They have to be removed. You have to stop the motivation. You have to reclaim the heart of Jerusalem. You have to do what David would have done. And if you do not do these kinds of things, shame on you. This is the right and the courageous thing to do. So, what's next? First, you expose Islam for what it really is. Second, you reveal what Islam did to your people on 10/7. Third, you remove Alaska Mosque and the Dome of the Rock and make Jerusalem whole again. The next thing you need to do is to never, ever say the word Palestine or Palestinian again, unless it is to denounce this myth. By you continuing to use the term Palestinian, you're feeding into your own destruction. You're essentially committing suicide. If you don't know it, you should know it. There is no such thing as a Palestinian. It was created in 1968 specifically for this purpose, to create the false impression that they were the proper owners of this land and that Jews were occupying Palestine, as opposed to these people without shared ethnicity being the usurpers. Last Philistine, of which the name was derived, was killed 2,300 years ago. The Gazans and those Muslims in the West Bank who identify themselves as Palestinians are lying to themselves and to the world. They have no shared history, no shared ethnicity. They're just malcontent Muslims who are largely inbred, and when tested have an exceedingly low IQ, who are particularly devoted to the annihilation of Jews. Stop using the term. Period. I mean, you must do this if you're going to survive. You have to start wielding words wisely. It is essential to your survival. Of course, there's only one real solution in the end, and that is you need to stop erasing Yahweh's name, writing him out of your lives. You need to listen to him after 3,400 years of ignoring him. I'll save that topic for my other programs, just as I did my previous one to you. So, these things known, I'm here to tell you that everything that is being proposed now is a very bad idea, and it's going to lead to a bad place, and that there is no way to write Donald Trump and his rhetoric out of the equation of being the Neville Chamberlain that ignites World War III by capitulating the heart of Israel to receive his Nobel Prize that he covets as the ultimate deal maker and peacemaker. It is going to happen. But there's lots you can do to mitigate the damage between now and then, and that's why I'm speaking to you. All right, now what I'd like to do is I want to give you a brief history of Islam as it relates to Jews. 1,400 years ago, a man who changed his name, he was Abu Qasim, to Muhammad because he sought praise. He was a psychopath. So he decided he would call himself the praised one. Left Kaabaville, we'll call it Kaabaville because there was no Mecca at the time. It was Petra, in shame. After 12 years of revealing Quran surahs, he had a handful of followers according to the Hadith. He had done everything imaginable to embarrass himself. As a matter of fact, the Alaska Mosque is a trophy to Islamic ignorance. He claimed that after admitting the satanic verses that all of Allah's messengers are inspired by Satan, that he rode a winged ass from Kaabaville to Jerusalem, although he didn't know the name of the city, to meet in the temple, although he didn't know there was a temple or that it had been destroyed 600 years earlier, to meet in there with all of the bigwigs of the Jewish people, everybody from Adam, which he didn't even know wasn't Jewish, and of course Noah, again not Jewish, Abraham, again not Jewish, all the way down. He claims he met with David, and Solomon, and of course the mythical Esau, according to the Arabic transliteration of Esau's name, the person God specifically called out that says, "I hate him." Interesting, because it was Ishmael's descendants through, and as they married into and along with Esau's descendants, that became the fodder for Islam. Well, he was run out of town, not at the end of a pitchfork or sword, but by laughter. They mocked him. And so he needed new digs. And so he went to every place around Kaabaville looking for someone who would take him in. There's not a lot of demand for false messiahs who are a laughingstock, who claim that they speak on behalf of Satan, and who constantly renege on their promises, and who has previously promised that he would slaughter his own people. But he found 20 pagans. They came from Yathrib, which was 75% a Jewish farming community, date farms. The largest Jewish community in Arabia, 30,000 Jews strong. And about a quarter of the population was pagan Arabs. And he met with 20 of them. And these men had heard that the Jews were awaiting the return of their Messiah. Of course, fooled by the rabbis, they didn't know who the Messiah actually is, or that he's dode, or have any clue when he's actually returning. But they got tired of hearing it. And so Muhammad convinced them that he was that Messiah. So now we have a third false Messiah: Jesus, Bar Kokhba, and Muhammad. Three so-called Abrahamic religions have that in common, all false messiahs. And as part of their commitment to take Muhammad into this city of Jews. They solicited the Pledge of Aqaba. Do you know what the Pledge of Aqaba is? And if you do not, and you're an Israeli, shame on you. It is the first day of the first year of the Islamic era. It's more important than the 50 or 60 Quran surahs that have been revealed before. More important than Ramadan, more important than anything to a Muslim, because it is year one of the Islamic era. We pledge to wage war against all humankind. The Pledge of Aqaba. It makes Islam a death cult. Not my interpretation. It's an irrefutable conclusion from the evidence. Muhammad went into Yathrib. He was welcomed in by these 20 pagans, and he immediately becomes a big shot and tries to convince the Jews that he is their Messiah. They mock him. They said, no, you don't have any of those criterion. And then Muhammad runs out of Quran material. He had based his early Quran recitals on pilfering poems from the Hanifs, which were Jewish converts, or excuse me, Arab converts to Judaism in, of all places, Yathrib, along with of course, the Houthis are there now. And he had even paid homage to the name they applied to their God, Ar-Rahman, the Merciful. His Quran surah is devoted to Ar-Rahman. And he just ran out of material. There wasn't enough material left for him to fill out his Quran to make it even appear religious. So the rabbis in Yathrib, and this is important for you to know, and it's undeniable as well. The rabbis in Yathrib made a deal with Muhammad for money. They sold him Talmud recitals. So if you want to know how the life of and times of Moshe got so perverted in the Quran, why Daud and Solomon are mentioned in the Quran, why the story of Adam is told in 50 conflicting ways, why Noah appears in the Quran, why all of these, the lives of these people are placed into this demonic book that is easily the worst book ever written, is because rabbis sold Muhammad Talmud readings. And Muhammad twisted every one of them to replicate his situation and made them what I call situational scriptures. They were all twisted to enable Muhammad to be the sand pirate he lusted to become. It's obvious. I prove it time and time again, hundreds and hundreds of times over in goddamn religion. And the Quran and Hadith confirm it. So one day, the rabbis, being rabbis, looking at everybody as beneath them, started mocking Muhammad for him claiming that Allah was giving him recitals that they knew they had read to him, and that he had twisted them in absurd ways. And Muhammad stopped paying his bills. So what do psychopaths do under those circumstances? They play nice and say, oh, you got me. I was just making all of this up. Let's all be buds. I'll pay my bills and we'll all be good in the end. No. Dead men tell no tales. He silenced those that knew the truth about him. And this is when the Quran and Muhammad turned genocidal. The 30,000 Jews in Yathrib were exiled, raped, sold into the slave trade, or executed. Muhammad actually was there one day where would have been 12 hours of having one Jewish boy and man after another stand before him over a trench that had been dug in the marketplace in the center of Yathrib, today's Medina. He mocked them, and then he cut off every man and boy's head, one after another. He made the women and girls watch. Muhammad had first pick as to who he would rape. And then he rewarded the Muslims who had perpetrated this grisly deed with a pecking order so that they could choose who they could rape. Then those too young to rape, they sold into slavery to buy more weapons and kill more Jews. This is the truth. It is undeniable. And it's important for you to know that Islam, Muhammad, and Allah declared war on you 1,400 years ago. Allah actually says that he was the terrorist, that he killed the Jews, that he enslaved them, that he was the one who gave the first Muslims the land that the Jews occupied. He brags about it right in the Quran. What I'm telling you is irrefutable, and it is essential knowledge. But that wasn't the end of it. Muhammad coveted the Kaaba, which was in Petra, as I say. And when he thought that he had led enough successful terrorist raids, he led 75 in the first 10 years of the Islamic era, only fought one defensive battle, and that one defensive battle was to thwart those who were tired of being terrorized by him, his own family, who had come to stop him from raping, plundering, and murdering them. And he thought he finally had enough weapons and enough men under arms, and he headed to Kabaville. And he got cold feet because as he approached, he realized the last time he had been here, he'd been laughed out of town. That these people knew him well, and that the last time he was not only laughed out of town, virtually all of his followers abandoned him, and Muhammad got cold feet. And he decided that he wouldn't attack, and so he signed with an X, because he was illiterate, the Pledge of Aqaba, where Muhammad acknowledged that he was not the messenger of Allah, that Allah was not God. And he committed that he and his Muslims would not terrorize anyone, including their own family members, which they had come to do. Not rape them, would not kidnap them for 10 years. The first Muslims that were with Muhammad at the time only followed Muhammad because the deal he gave them was they got to keep 80% of what they stole. If they were killed in the process of terrorizing other people, they got a heavenly reward with multiple virgins. And if they survived it, they got 80% of the spoil, and he and his wannabe God got 20. But he offered them a religious sanction on plunder. The 8th surah, the Quran even says stealing is lawful and good. Allah orders Muslims to fight and kill for him. And it says any Muslim that refuses to fight and kill for him ceases to be a Muslim. And the good Muslims are supposed to kill them so Allah can torture them forever in hell. There can be no moderate Muslims, according to the Quran, according to Allah. So the first Muslims, being told now that they were not going to plunder and rape and enslave their own extended family members and around the Kaaba, were up in arms. And they began to turn on Muhammad. He needed a quick fix. And the first Jews that he had sent out of Yathrib had gone to Kabar. Perhaps you've heard of the place, to farm dates there. Muhammad made a beeline to Kabar, where he laid siege. It's where the phrase called the prayer of fear, Allahu Akbar, first emerged, where the line is, Allah is greater than the God of the Jews, Yahowah. Muhammad was savage there. The Jews were not just conquered, they were butchered. Once again, the women were all raped, the children were enslaved. It was a bloodbath far worse than what happened on 10/7 of 23. That was it for the Jews of Arabia. It was genocide. You need to know that truth. You need to know that history. You need to know you cannot negotiate with a religion that is devoted to your demise. You need to know that in the Quran, in the 9th Surah, Allah specifically says that any treaty between a Muslim and a non-Muslim is not binding on the Muslim, which is to say they will tell you anything, as will the Saudi Arabians when they promise to trade peace and normalization, recognizing Israel's right to exist, the very heart of Israel, giving it to the Muslim terrorists who will then devour it. The Treaty of Hudaybiyah is essential to Islam. It is irrefutable as a part of Islam, and it authorizes Muslims to do exactly what they are doing, which is why you can never negotiate with them. Even Yahowah tells you in Devarim 7, no, ever do you negotiate with them. So let's move forward in time. I've been posting on X recently, something that I came to learn some 20 years ago when writing the first version of Prophet of Doom, which became Goddamn Religion. And that is that Hitler's Mein Kampf and the Quran and Hadith are exceedingly similar. So similar, I devoted 100 pages to juxtaposing Hitler's statements in Mein Kampf with Allah and Muhammad's statements in the Quran and Hadith. It is exactly the same belief system. So much so that Hitler only had one SS division, Hansacar, that wasn't German, and they were Muslims. They were the SS division that at the Nuremberg trials were called out for a special dispensation because they had been so murderous and so savage that they were called a criminal enterprise. But that's not the story I want you to know. The story I want you to know is because the British government reneged on a promise they had made to Israel. When they prevailed in World War I against Germany in significant degree because of what Chaim Weizmann had done for them in the development of synthetic rubber and smokeless gunpowder. And he asked for one thing. He says, I want a homeland for my people because at the end of World War I, you inherited the entire Middle East, essentially. That little tiny sliver of land that is today Israel and Jordan. I want that for my people's homeland. It's always been my people's homeland. And the British government said, absolutely, sure. Signed an agreement to do that and said, nothing will stand in the way of us doing that. And then they completely reneged on it, which is why there were so many Jews still in Europe to endure the Holocaust. But it gets far worse. The Brits continued to prop up a man who referred to himself as the Grand Mufti, who was the Islamic leader under their jurisdiction. He not only led many racist and terrorist, horrible, savage attacks against Jews in their own homeland. When Hitler rose to power, the Grand Mufti went to Berlin. And in Berlin, the Grand Mufti, this leader of the region the Brits had failed to give to Israel, convinced Adolf Hitler of doing something that would cost 6 million Jews their lives. Adolf Hitler's intent was to rob them and exile them. Mr. Mufti, one of them killed. exterminated rather than exiled. And they were. So what's worse? The Nazis that built the camps to accomplish the Muslim agenda, or the Muslims that sent them there to die? Let's go forward in time. Israel becomes a state. And when they become a state, you've got every Muslim nation around Israel declaring war on Israel. The agreement to give them this little tiny strip of land as their homeland back, which was a tiny portion of the commitment that preceded it with the Balfour Declaration, was rejected by the Muslims, which makes it insane that they would request that same status now when they not only turned it down, they turned it down with every weapon they could bring to obliterate Israel. You don't get to say, oh, we'll go back and accept that agreement now that we've had our butts kicked every way but Sunday, or Friday in their case. It's disgusting. Nonetheless, they fought the wars of 1948, of 1967, and 1973, and lost every one of them. But along the way, the world made Israel capitulate and give back what it had gained. The terrible decision. But I guess the world doesn't care much for Jews. We're learning that now, aren't we? So when the Muslims found that they could not defeat the Jews, even if they outnumbered them 100 to 1, had better weapons, succeeded Israel in every possible way, but they couldn't defeat Israel militarily. The Egyptian government, under Nasser, the Russian KGB, the Muslim Brotherhood, found a really nasty Muslim that they could influence. His name was Yasser Arafat. Truth is, they could influence him because Muslims don't take well to men who were homosexual, which he was. And collectively, they created this concept of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. They created its flag, which was simply the Jordanian flag minus the star. And they decided that the ultimate way for them to prevail against Israel was to pretend that the malcontent Muslims there that were once part of Egypt and Gaza, once part of Jordan and the West Bank, were Palestinians. And that the land was Palestine. And they were to liberate Palestine from those dastardly Jews. And wouldn't you know, the lie took root. And now it is believed by 99% of the world's population. It's not much of a history, is it? Based upon an outright lie, a fabricated myth by the Muslim Brotherhood and the KGB in 1968 to create a false identity. As a result of this, Yasser Arafat's PLO launched two murderous intifadas against Jews. Now the world is calling for a worldwide intifada, worldwide savage terrorist attack on the Jewish people. And what happened was that the Muslims who were living in Israel at the time were the best educated, longest lived, healthiest, freest, most prosperous Muslims in the world. That was really embarrassing to Muslims worldwide when the best educated, healthiest, freest, and most productive Muslims in the world were living and working in Israel. So Yasser Arafat's solution to that, go kill your employers. You murder your employers, you're not going to be the most prosperous Muslims in the world. And then we can make you look like victims. And we can kill some Jews in the process. That was the purpose of the Intifadas. And to terrorize Jews into submission, because terror is a tactic. And I'm so upset when people say, well, we killed some terrorists. What a stupid statement. We're fighting a war against terrorism. That's even a more stupid statement. Terrorism is a tactic. It's not an identity of a group. Terror is the tactic that is deployed against civilizations and against communities to wear them down so they lose the will to fight. When the Muslims and progressives are marching in the streets of Europe and America and congregating and screaming on college campuses, what they're trying to do is intimidate those that they want to control into surrendering and not fighting them, acquiescing to their control. That's the purpose of terrorism. It's a tactic. You cannot fight a war against a tactic. When you say we're in there fighting the war against terrorism, it's utter nonsense, Israel. You're fighting a war against Islam, and you might as well admit it, or you have no chance of prevailing during it. So the next man in this equation of people I've come to know along the way is Sinwar. Sinwar has come to realize that since Islam is so brutal, my Wookiee is trying to tell my Asher that there's some milk on the floor in here, and that even though he is the smaller dog, he's the boy and he's really macho, and therefore it's his milk, and he'd rather keep Asher away from it than actually drink it. That's, even dogs can't be perfect sometimes. So where are we here? We have Sinwar. He has realized that because all of the Gazans are Muslims and that Islam condones any form of violence if it's ultimately directed towards the killing of Jews, that he once empowered, because the PLO lost the confidence of the people because it wasn't violent enough for today's Muslims. If there was an election in the West Bank today, and the reason there hasn't been an election in 20 some odd years in the West Bank or amongst the so-called Fakistinians, is that the Fatah, which is nothing but in fact, even operates as the PLO, that Fatah would lose probably in the range of 80% to 20%. There'd be a landslide. And that Hamas would prevail because Hamas is more ruthless and more savage against the eradication of Jews. And that's what happened in Gaza. The United States, 20 years ago, under George Bush, made the hellacious mistake, and I have not heard George Bush apologize for this, telling Jews they needed to leave Gaza, and they left Gaza for the malcontent Muslims there to arm themselves in the teeth and perpetrate 10/7. And so here we are with now Gaza being run and equipped and armed and funded, indoctrinated for a single purpose: genocide against Jews and the extermination of the state of Israel. And the world's response to that is to reward them with a state carved out of the heart of Israel. This is where you are. This is why I strongly begged Israel to take a different approach on 10/7 of 23 and to fight this war against Islam with your brains rather than with bombs. If you told the truth about why that ugly scar exists on the Temple Mount, then you would have every right to remove it. If you told the truth about Islam, then those Muslims who are not hell-bent on killing you would recognize their religion is worthless. Many would leave it. And you would make it far more difficult for anyone to fund this Islamic terrorist manifesto and death cult. And your people would be protected, such that the realization that you can negotiate with these people would be utter nonsense, and you would know that you can't do it. Far more people would stand with Israel. Yes, you're not going to get the world to stand with you, but far more would do as I'm doing if they knew what I know. But Israel, you are the only people on earth that can take what I know to such an extent that the world begins to listen. It is you who need to embrace what I have learned. Use your brains. Stop using your bombs. Protect Israel from this deadly plague. Make reasoned and rational decisions based upon the evidence. And recognize what the world is trying to do to you, including the Neville Chamberlain that currently occupies the White House. And be very, very careful. I thank you for listening. I realize that much of what I had to say is not what you wanted to hear. But there is nothing more important for you to know than what I have just shared. I appreciate you listening. This has been a special edition of the YAHOWAH blog, and I'm your host, Craig Winn.